As part of our special coverage of Colombia's presidential elections, we now receive Benjamin Norton, international analyst, author, and founder of independent news portal Multipolarista. Welcome, Benjamin. You know, it's always a pleasure to receive you here from the South and in teleSUR English, and in teleSUR Spanish too, because you are a dear friend of us. So now Colombia lives a paramount age, not only for its future, but also for the region. There are recent reports of people in Cauca region crossing rivers since Saturday just to go to vote today, as well as LGBTQI and youth activists calling for their peers to go and vote, which is an unprecedented display of political will from those sectors in Colombia's history, marked by blank vote and abstentionism. What's behind this? What is causing this?
Well, this is an absolutely historic victory, and the reason that the social movements in Colombia mobilized to make this victory happen is because this is the first left-wing president-elect in Colombia's history. Now, unfortunately, Colombia has a very authoritarian government, very corrupt, so we will see if the oligarchy in Colombia allows Petro to take power. But this is the first time that a left-wing candidate has won the election. And not only is this victory important because of the historic triumph of Petro, who is a former guerrilla, former revolutionary, but also because of the vice president, Francia Marquez. This is the first time that in Colombia a representative from the Afro-Colombian community will have representation in the government as vice president. This is a community that has historically been completely marginalized by the state, has been victimized with a lot of violence by the state. And Francia Marquez herself comes from the social movements that have been terrorized by paramilitary groups linked to the state, and especially in the last 20 years under Uribismo, the right-wing movement that has dominated the state for 20 years. And this victory has really buried Uribismo. It's made it clear that Álvaro Uribe, the former right-wing president, who is closely linked to drug trafficking and death squads, paramilitary groups, that his political legacy is over, and the Colombian people have demanded change.
Yes, they were demanding change, and I think they achieved the change in the polls. Now, let's talk about the region. Let's talk about how this victory of Petro could mean, or well, how this could impact all the region. Because we know Colombia has a twisted history in relations with Venezuela and with other neighboring countries. In any case, what this victory of Petro could mean to the region and also to the environment in political scope.
Very important for the region. Colombia has never had a left-wing government. In fact, former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America, basically as an imperialist outpost for the United States. So this is massively going to change Colombia's geopolitical role. That said, I don't want to overstate the change. We should be clear that Gustavo Petro is not necessarily a friend of Venezuela. He did make a lot of strange comments criticizing Venezuela. I would say very inaccurate comments about Venezuela, about Nicaragua, and about Cuba. But let's be clear, the alternative is very different. I mean, the current far-right president of Colombia, Iván Duque, still recognizes this coup leader, Juan Guaidó, as fake imaginary interim president. Guaidó has never received a vote in a presidential election. And now Gustavo Petro has made it clear that while he has made regrettable criticisms of Venezuela, he has also made it clear that he's going to recognize the constitutional legitimate president, Nicolás Maduro. He's going to normalize relations with his neighbor, and he's going to end the coup policies because the current far-right president, Iván Duque, has backed numerous violent attacks on his neighbor Venezuela, including in 2020 so-called Operation Gideon, which was a failed invasion of the country, along with failed assassination attempts against Maduro. So while Petro is not going to necessarily be a new Chavista, he's not the Hugo Chavez of Colombia, he is going to normalize relations, which is going to help the economy of both Venezuela and Colombia. He's going to end the cross-border terrorist attacks on Venezuela, and he's going to allow Venezuelan and Colombians to cross that border freely, because let's not forget, there are also millions of Colombians who are in Venezuela, and there are also Venezuelans who have migrated into Colombia. So normalizing relations is going to be good for people on both sides of the border.
Well, even if he's just normalizing relations, I think that's a good news. So, Benjamin, I have another question. We were talking about how this could change the regional relationships and dynamics, but how this also overturns, in any case, the U.S. presence in the region and the U.S. traction in the region. Because we know recently Francia Marquez said her government, her administration with Petro, wants to be respectful with relations with the U.S. What this could mean, how this could change their presence, the U.S. presence in the region, taking into account several changes in the government, several turns of the governments in the region, and especially this one.
Well, this is the key question. Of course, on the political campaign, we did see that Petro and Marquez made comments making it clear that they didn't want to ostracize the U.S., they didn't want to invite a coup against them, right? So I understand why they made those statements. The U.S. has a long history of organizing coups to overthrow democratic left-wing governments, going back to, of course, the famous coup against Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, which was organized by the CIA. So I get why they would make comments like that for diplomatic reasons. But let's be clear, the U.S. is very unhappy with this result, and the U.S. is very likely going to try to mobilize its assets in Colombia against Petro, and it's going to be very difficult for Petro to govern. I think we really need to be clear here that not only is the element of the U.S. against him, Petro is a former revolutionary socialist guerrilla who is in the M19 armed movement, but also let's not forget that the Colombian military, which is closely linked to the U.S. military, the U.S. military has several military bases in Colombia, and the Colombian military regularly trains with the U.S. military. In fact, a few months ago, they did military exercises in the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Venezuela using nuclear submarines. So that was a threat to Venezuela and left-wing forces. And furthermore, the head of the Colombian military, Eduardo Zapatero, also publicly criticized the candidate, Petro, during the presidential campaign, which violates Colombian law. That was a major violation of the Colombian constitution, and that was a very dangerous sign that the Colombian military does not want the constitutional process to go through, and that they will be fighting against Petro now that he is president-elect. And then finally, there's another element here that I should stress, which is the fact that Petro's party doesn't have a majority in the Congress. In both of the chambers of the Congress, they're still dominated, both the Senate and the Chamber of Representatives are dominated by the right wing, which are closely allied to the United States. So the U.S. is going to be against him. The right-wing Colombian oligarchy is going to be against him. The military leadership has already made it clear that it's against him. And of course, there are also right-wing paramilitary groups that have not disarmed and that they don't want the peace process to go through, which is something that Petro has promised. Petro and Marquez have also talked about the importance of land reform in Colombia. There's never been significant land reform in Colombia, and all of those forces I mentioned, the U.S., the oligarchy, the military, and the paramilitary groups are against those campaign promises. So it's going to be very difficult for Petro to govern.
You were mentioning, Benjamin, a paramount aspect in Petro's career and background. He is a former combatant, a former member of the guerrillas. In this case, we were talking about how this election could turn the tide for outside of Colombia. In any case, the region and the U.S. But now let's think about how this turn the tables for the inside of Colombia. In the case of the massacres of social leaders, environmental leaders, how the Petro government can change this violent scenario.
Well, this is the question, because Colombia has the most massacres of human rights activists in the entire world. Although this is almost never mentioned in the Western media, which constantly attacks Venezuela. Meanwhile, in neighboring Colombia, last year alone, there were more than 90 massacres and more than 300 activists were killed. And that is a consistent pattern. Every single year, hundreds of social movement activists are killed. Francia Marquez herself comes from the social movement of Colombia, and she has made it clear that as vice president, she's going to emphasize peace and try to protect social movement activists. And that's extremely important because for the last 20 years, most of the presidents, especially Uribe and Duque, have been linked to these paramilitary groups. Uribismo is closely linked to the paramilitaries. In fact, the Uribe family ranch was also one of the main bases of a paramilitary group called the 12 Apostles, which has been linked to killing social movement activists. So the fact that the government is now going to prioritize defending those social movement activists is a very significant change. Although, again, I think we should keep in mind that the very wealthy and very powerful oligarchy in Colombia, these multimillionaires, people like Rodolfo Hernandez, who was the right-wing candidate in the second round, these oligarchs are closely linked to the paramilitary groups, and historically, oligarchs like Uribe have used the paramilitary groups to target social movement activists to try to remove them from their land so multinational corporations can exploit that land, and have also killed left-wing activists who challenge them. So I think it's going to be very dangerous for Petro and Marquez. We saw even during the presidential campaign, whenever they spoke at a rally, they would only do so with security teams holding large shields in front of them. So now that they're president and vice president, the threats against them are going to multiply. So the reality is not only are social movement activists at threat of being killed by these paramilitary groups, but the president-elect and the vice president-elect themselves are also they're very much in danger of being targeted.
So thank you, Benjamin, for your time and opinions here, and for the audience and us hearing from the South.
My pleasure.